sacred texts. In the land of Judea, there were many academies of holy learning. The Pharisees, the scholars and teachers, brought study to the people. The Greek ideal had been for universal education of the people. The Pharisees made it a Jewish ideal as well. The academies of Judea attracted students from Jewish communities everywhere. Among those who came from Babylon to study in Judea in the days of King Herod was a man called Hillel. To pay for his education, he worked as a woodcutter. He brought a depth of wisdom that would infuse the teachings of the Pharisees with a new humanity and compassion.
The more Torah, the more life. The more study and contemplation, the more wisdom.
When asked to define the essential message of Judaism, Hillel is said to have replied,
"What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole of the Torah. All else is commentary."
His words would be cherished by generations of scholars to this very day. Judea, in the years following King Herod's death, was a land beset by difficulties. The first century of the Common Era saw a series of Roman governors there, men who had little knowledge of Jewish ways and who wished only to profit at the expense of the people. There was political repression and poverty. The tumultuous years of that century would be long remembered, written about, portrayed, debated. It is in times of suffering like these that the dreams of a people become most vivid. In Judea, the hope for a God-appointed savior began to stir the populace. They waited expectantly for the leader promised by the prophets, an anointed one, a Messiah. Leaders did appear. Some claimed to be messiahs, some prophets. Others simply wished to take up arms against Rome. Throughout the land, people responded to those who offered hope. Among these was a man called Yeshua, a young carpenter from Galilee. He was a preacher who quoted the prophets and whose words reflected the teachings of the Pharisees.
You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these commandments depend all the law and the prophets.
His teachings, like those of the Torah, spoke of justice to man and worship of God. Yet he asked his followers to go beyond the laws to attain a selflessness and humanity which would purify and transform them.
Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Great crowds followed the preacher Yeshua from Galilee and Judea and beyond the Jordan. To the Roman rulers, this Jesus, as they called him, was a political threat, a possible focus of rebellion. Since Herod's death, Judea had been in ferment. In Jericho, a former slave of Herod had proclaimed himself king and sacked the palace. In Galilee, a rebel army attacked 2 Roman legions. The rebels were punished in the Roman style, 2,000 men nailed to crosses. In Idumea, 10,000 men were under arms. Samaria was in revolt. Rebels, fanatics, messiahs everywhere. The Roman response, as always, was greater force and greater cruelty. Anyone with a following was suspect. The Romans looked for ringleaders and killed them. Among those who died was the preacher from Galilee, Jesus. But the spirit of revolt in Judea could not be quelled. Rebellion broke out again in the year 66 of the Common Era, with devastating consequences. It began here, at the great Roman fortress of Masada. This complex brooded 1,300 feet above the Judean desert to the west of the Dead Sea. In the summer of the year 66, a band of revolutionaries called Sicarii seized the fortress and massacred its garrison. Herod had built a palace complex there, well supplied with water and fortified with masonry to withstand a siege. It became a desert stronghold of rebellion. Masada was one of the opening engagements of a widespread war. The details of what later happened there are a matter of conjecture, but Masada's resistance made it a legend forever. All of Judea had followed Masada into revolt, driven by the desperate hope for independence. For 4 years, the Jews battled Roman forces. Then in the year 70 of the Common Era, in the early spring, the Romans began the final act. Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, brought 4 legions to assault Jerusalem. They laid siege to it for 5 months. The city was reduced to starvation, its inhabitants dying in the streets. The Jewish defenders turned against each other. The most extreme, the Zealots, fought anyone they thought might yield to Roman might. They seized the temple, and from behind its sacred walls, they attacked both Romans and their fellow Jews. The city seethed with violence and death. Finally, in the Jewish month of Av, the Roman forces stormed the Temple Mount. On the 9th day of that month, on orders of the Roman general, the temple was burned to the ground. The temple, the center of the nation, the center of the faith, was turned to ashes. Systematically, the legions reduced the city that had been so great by fire. They destroyed houses, meeting places, public buildings, everything but 3 of the towers that Herod had built. The Romans left Jerusalem in ruins, and the 10th Legion set up its camp among the smoking stones. Nothing remained of Herod's white and gold temple. All that survived was a segment of the wall protecting the hill on which it had stood. But for as long as it existed, men would recognize it for what it was and would venerate it.
The Lord has done what he purposed, has carried out his threat, as he ordained long ago. He has demolished without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes.
Titus, in triumph, carried off the sacred objects of the Jews, among them the holy menorah, the symbol of the people. He had put Judea in chains. He gloried in his success and proclaimed it to the Roman populace with a triumphal arch. But it was an empty victory and a vain boast. The full weight of empire had fallen on the Jews, merciless and inflexible, but it had not quite destroyed them. Life returned, very slowly, in modest ways, but it did return. In the countryside of Judea, a scholar, Yochanan ben Zakkai, established a small academy. It was a humble place, a place where teachers and scholars might gather, where the learning of the people might be preserved. With no temple in Judea, no priests, no center of worship, the task of preserving the Jewish heritage fell to the scholars known as Pharisees. Their teachings would be handed on from generation to generation. It was at the Academy of Ben Zakkai that for the first time scholars were ordained and given the title rabbi. It was the rabbis who in time became the shapers of Judaism, the leaders of the Jews. From the destruction of Solomon's temple more than 600 years before, to the Roman destruction of the temple that Herod had built, the Jewish people had not only survived conquest, they had sanctified a body of knowledge and custom, of ritual and belief that we now call Judaism. In the centuries to come, the beliefs so passionately held by the Jews would spread around the world.
For now there were more Jews living and working and worshipping outside of Judea than there were left in the Promised Land. In a sense, the dispersion strengthened the Jewish people and kept Judaism alive after they had once more seen their temple reduced to ashes.
It was the Jews of the diaspora, congregations in North Africa, far south in Egypt, in Greece and Anatolia, and in Rome itself, who demonstrated the overriding and everlasting force of the Word. It was they who passed its message of a universal God and a universal moral code to the rest of mankind. Rome, the ruler of nations. By the 1st century of the present era, all the lands of the Mediterranean had been brought together in the greatest political and military enterprise the world had ever known. The military power of Rome reshaped the governments, the nations, and the peoples of its empire into a single international order. 100 different traditions and cultures were brought together in this vast experiment of rule. Its effect on the Jews, its effect on all peoples, would be profound. No one could have foreseen the long-range impact of the great Roman conquest, least of all the Romans themselves.
The world, as all men had known it, was coming to an end, brought to a close in part by the power of Rome. The centuries that lay ahead would bring with them dramatic change. Rome would not cause that change. Rome itself would be swept up by it, helpless in the face of forces greater than its own. But the vast proportions of the Roman Empire would contribute to an international dialogue whose effects would be far-reaching. New religions and forms of belief would arise and capture the minds and souls of millions of people from the Atlantic coasts of Europe to the farthest reaches of China. A spiritual revolution was about to sweep the world, and the Jews were to have a central role in the drama.
At the beginning of the present era, the Jews lived scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Centuries of trouble in their native land of Judea had driven many of them to find homes in other countries of the East and the Mediterranean. In this Greek-speaking world, the word for the dispersion of a people was diaspora. Diaspora, it was a fundamental and inescapable element of Jewish life. At least 3 out of every 4 Jews lived outside of Judea. There were Jewish communities in Egypt, Greece, and Asia Minor, in Babylonia, and in North Africa. Home for the Jews might be a rich seaport on the coast of the Mediterranean, or a remote outpost of trade in the desert of what is now Morocco. The ancient world had never known a people quite like the Jews. A book, the Bible, was at the center of their worship. A book and a body of law. On the island of Djerba, in what is now Tunisia, is a Jewish community said to date back more than 2,000 years. Some of its members still wear black leg bands in mourning for the destruction of Solomon's temple more than 2,500 years ago. The image of Jewish life revealed here is one almost untouched by time. Each moment of life was regulated by the sacred law. Each action was seen as dedicated to God. Their lives were bound up in their religion in their lives. Dio Cassius, the Roman historian, commented,
"They are distinguished from the rest of humanity in practically every detail of their lives, but especially in that they refuse to honor any of the usual gods and adore one particular divinity with great ardor and worship him in the most extravagant fashion."
The exclusive worship of one universal God. The idea was a novelty. The Jews, scattered as they were, became emissaries for this new view of the world and the universe. By the end of the 1st century, Josephus, the Jewish historian, could observe,
"The masses have been for a long time filled with enthusiasm for our pious customs. And there isn't a city in Greece or a people among the barbarians which does not practice our custom of weekly rest, our fasts, our lighting of lamps, or many of our dietary laws. And thus God is known the world over."
Everywhere customs were being influenced by Jewish customs, beliefs by Jewish beliefs. The city of ancient Rome. It was a metropolis of almost modern proportions. 1 million people lived in its tenements and palaces. Its teeming streets and marketplaces were a magnet that drew people from all over the Mediterranean. The city embraced them all, tolerating the customs and gods of 100 foreign peoples. Gods, demigods, spirits, centaurs and heroes. Roman religion was a blend of folklore and reverence. Out of this mixture came a single popular culture. It was a culture in which all could share. All, that is, except the Jews. Here in Ostia, the port of ancient Rome, at the mouth of the river Tiber, lie the ruins of a synagogue whose foundations date back to the 1st century. The Jews, alone among all the peoples under Roman rule, did not worship Roman gods, nor could they obey Roman laws if doing so meant violating their own sacred customs. Rome was powerless to change their ways, powerless except by force of arms. But the issue seemed a minor matter, a question of custom and belief. And so the Roman government granted them the right to be different. With official toleration came increasing acceptance of Jewish ideas as well. Many throughout the empire were attracted by Jewish beliefs. Many abandoned their gods, turned their backs on custom, and began to worship the one God of the Jews.